Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the Repair Lab's Nature of Justice workshop series. I'm Andrew Carl, and I'm Professor of History and African American Studies at UVA and co-director of the Repair Lab. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Julie Z. Dr. Z is Professor of American Studies at UC Davis and is the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for UC Davis's John Muir Institute for the Environment. Over the course of her career, Professor Z has written extensively on environmental justice and inequality, urban health, and social activism. Her first book, Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice, revealed how the privatizing and deregulatory logics of modern urban policy and planning work to concentrate the ill effects of environmental pollution and decay in Black, brown, and low-income neighborhoods, and how those communities fought back. Out of these grassroots fights at the neighborhood level, Z shows how a larger activist community took shape and locates where the work of movement building begins. Her most recent book is entitled Environmental Justice. In this powerful volume, Z reveals the ties that bind racial injustice, capitalism, neoliberalism, and the climate crisis together, as seen in places like Flint, Michigan, and Standing Rock, in post-Katrina New Orleans, and post-Maria Puerto Rico. From these recent cases, Z captures the broader significance and potential of environmental justice movements to disrupt dominant belief systems and ideologies. Her book calls for us to find those links between state violence and ecological destruction, between pillaging of natural resources and pillaging of people. And out of that deeper understanding, practice forms of radical empathy and nurture cultures of solidarity, and begin to imagine a post-capitalist future. This book provides disturbing clarity to the challenges we face and the engines that are driving it, while at the same time counseling us against nihilism and despair. It's really an urgent book in these perilous times, and one whose framework for understanding the relationship between racial injustice and the climate crisis shapes and informs how the Repair Lab approaches these questions and pursues scholarly and policy interventions, which is why we are so thrilled to have Professor Z with us this afternoon to discuss her work and her thoughts on the work we are aiming to do here. Following her presentation, Professor Z will be joined in conversation by Sophia Baumert. Dr. Baumert is a postdoctoral fellow in the Engagements Core curriculum at the University of Virginia, where she teaches courses on infrastructural aesthetics and racial geographies. She earned her PhD in English at UC Davis, and her research focuses on race and urban space in American literature. Following their discussion, we will open it up to questions from you to our speaker. We will collect questions throughout the event using the Zoom's Q&A chat box. We encourage you to submit questions at any point during the event. You don't need to wait for the Q&A to begin to submit them, and we'll try to get to all of them during the Q&A. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Julie Z to the Repair Lab.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm very excited to be with you virtually. Yesterday I did a talk and I got the day wrong, so I was very crazed, but today at least I have the day and time correct. So I'm already pleased with the talk and how that's going. I wanted to talk with just some preliminary thoughts on recognition, restoration, and reparations, some of the things that I've been thinking about now and how they align with the work of the Repair Lab. But first I want to start with this question of Grace Lee Boggs' question. And for those of you who don't know Grace Lee Boggs, she is a radical activist in Detroit. She and her husband, James Boggs, were important organizers, radical organizers in Detroit. And she asked, what time is it on the clock of the world? And so I'll just leave that as an opening question that I have been thinking about with many others and thinking alongside people like Grace Lee Boggs and inspired by them. And that is the work that drives me, is to think about how my work can contribute to the radical theory and activism from people like the Boggs. So I was very pleased and excited to see your initiative from the Repair Lab, just from the naming itself, which I know that it's very difficult to come up with names because the names set the agenda of what your project is. But I really think the idea of twinning racial injustice and climate change very explicitly, and this idea of repair are really the central and most innovative thing that you're doing in conceptualizing the work that you have set out, the very difficult work you've set out to do. Your questions and the directorship and the heavy interdisciplinarity is really quite unique and impressive. So I think these questions are absolutely the ones that have driven my work and scholar activism for over, at this point, 28 years. I started this work as a student activist at Berkeley in the mid-90s. And so although I'm not a historian or a geographer, I'm heavily impacted by those fields and political ecology, et cetera. So in my own teaching in environmental justice, for me, interdisciplinarity is very central to the project. This cannot be a scientific or technical or engineering project alone. And so my work really began, again, as a student activist, as an undergrad. But the first, third, and fifth are the individual books I've written. And the second one, it represents the engaged scholarship I did as the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project. And that's a picture of Teresa de Anda, who is a pesticide drift activist. You can see the fields and then, her home right across. And she died of cancer very early on, very, very tragically young. And she believes it was because of the exposure to all the pesticides. And so that, I think, encapsulates a lot of the public engagement work that I try to do on a campus that is a very STEM heavy land grant university. And then the fourth book in that is an edited collection I did called Sustainability Approaches to Environmental Justice and Social Power. I just want to talk about that book briefly because I think it really aligns with the question of interdisciplinarity and why it's essential in thinking about climate change and environmental pollution more broadly. In that book, in the edited collection, especially in the introduction, we really think about how what kinds of questions are being asked. And what we try to talk about is the idea of sustainability as not like an object that you achieve, but a process, and a process that's engaged in crossing boundaries between fields, between campus and community, between past and present, and across geographic space. We talk about the need for radical interdisciplinarity. And that introduction, I was the lead author, but it was written by 8 other of my colleagues from a wide array of fields. And so, this question of interdisciplinarity and why it's important, not for the sake of interdisciplinarity, I think is something that is very important in the work that I've done and in the Repair Lab as you're setting out your own agenda. And, in more broad terms, in climate change and climate politics and the politics of the just transition, these are not only technical, scientific questions, but historical and political ones as well. And so in that book, we talk about the need for thinking about sustainability and sustainable development within structures of power. And there's lots of examples of that. We try to think about how sustainability is defined and how both economically and how it can exacerbate problems of gentrification and affordability. We talk about the need for environmental humanities, radical interdisciplinarity as well. My colleague, Mary Catanasso, who's an urban ecologist, talks about in the plant sciences, her department, interdisciplinary is someone who works on a stem of a plant and someone who works on a root of a plant. And yes, that is one form of interdisciplinarity, but we're talking about sort of radical interdisciplinarity in kind of both senses of the term. We, in the volume and in the individual case studies, talk about the need to centralize and foreground issues of gender, sexuality, race, and indigeneity. And we talk about the lineages of just sustainability and environmental justice research and the continuing work that is being done around sustainability, and in your case, the climate justice repair lab agenda. These are not temporal. It's like you don't go from one to the other. These are multiply existing temporally and in terms of the content of what they're doing. Yesterday, there was a big celebration of the 30 years of the principles of environmental justice being formed. And there was a lot of storytelling about how those principles came to be. And so, it's not like, you have environmental justice and then you have climate justice. These things are coexisting. And I remember actually the first time I heard about climate justice and climate change was in an environmental justice organizing context. And so, one of the questions, when we think about time and temporality, and especially, as a historian or people who read history, hopefully environmental history and history more broadly, one of the questions that I'm really curious about now is what can we do, given that there aren't explicit laws, that there are still intergenerational legacies of these systems being sort of locked into place. And that's, I think, part of what I'm talking about. The just transition is both the transition to a post-carbon or decarbonizing future, but for me, sitting where I sit, having done the work I've done for 28 years, we're also at a transition inflection point where people understand a lot of the problems that 28 years ago, there was much more of a focus on, oh, we need to empirically document that these things are real. I mean, I remember these conversations about, is it race versus class, or, as if those things could be separate, or, trying to prove that there were such things as racialized environmental inequities. Well, at this point, there's pretty much a lot of scholarship around inequities more broadly, health inequities, pollution inequities, et cetera. And we're at a different moment where we need to think about the politics of reparations and repair, in other words. Just briefly to bring it back to climate very quickly, and hopefully, again, in the conversation in the Q&A, we can talk through. A lot of work has been done about climate injustice as violence. We know this in terms of disasters, impacts, and injustices. I wanted to just talk about Virginia briefly. There was an amazing comedy show called Ain't Your Mama's Heat Wave that takes place in Norfolk, Virginia. And I highly recommend that you folks, if you're interested in sort of teaching cultures of climate change and climate resistance, the organizers of this comedy show talk about being impacted by Hurricane Katrina. My most recent book is the Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. The royalties go to two organizations I've worked with for one of them for over 25 years. That question in the book is a very simple: what crossroads and moment are we in now? What might we learn from environmental justice movements in our moment of danger? The argument is pretty simple, that environmental justice or freedom struggles that are particularly significant now, they're intersectional and they cross time and space. The third chapter, and again, thinking about environmental justice as a freedom movement means we have to engage with questions of history, violence, and imaginary and visionary perspectives. So this question of recognition, I'm not saying that we're post-recognition or post-empirical. I'm not saying that at all. But what we are, at this point, this is fairly well-trod territory. And it's actually, even in a broader sense, more people understand that there are these problems. And so examples are in climate injustice, the legacies of redlining and watered energy. So, in the third chapter, I talk about Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria. I talk about the politics of cultural production around climate justice, climate disaster, and what we need to move towards is a politics of a non-naive radical hope. I always tell this story that the first time I encountered climate justice, there was this fact sheet that from the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Coalition in 1997, did this fact sheet about what it would look like if a hurricane hit New Orleans. And I remember it was 97, and I remember reading and going, that can't happen. It was sort of my own naivete, and of course what they did was exactly predicted what happened in 2005. Again, there's a lot of reports that I've written about how climate change will expand and magnify inequality. These are obviously colonial maps, or obvious to me, obvious to some, maybe not to others. This is an example of what the impacts will be. Again, colonial afterlife of colonial map, I would argue. There's afterlives of redlining, and there's a lot of that's available online on this issue. And again, I always like to date myself now because I'm 48. I'm a Gen Xer. I came of an age when there were still like transparencies and slides were being put on top of each other. Well, GIS really changes that. And is able to visualize across time and space in a way that just simply wasn't possible technologically 28 years ago. And so, for example, now we have so many great web reports around, what the legacies of redlining are, what their environmental impacts are in terms of, tree cover, exposure to air pollution, how it's linked to related to lead exposure, asthma, et cetera. How it's connected to the politics of urban displacement and tied to gentrification. even. And California, the Cal EPA, our version of EPA, produced the story map, which looks at the legacy of redlining and environmental injustice. And it's been very interesting to be kind of the ear on the wall within staffers at Cal EPA, trying to say, okay, well, look, the state, we weren't neutral actors in this. The state actually produced this. So what are our responsibilities now as regulators, as people who, approve permits and so on? What does knowing that history mean when redlining, this isn't explicit policy within banks and the government anymore. And yet there are those legacies that we still have to live with. And we, of course, some more than others. Again, this question of reparative or restorative justice is something that I talk briefly about in chapter 3. And I give some examples of what I think that might look like. Some of the other work, this is a little bit out of order, as Environmental Justice Project, I guess it's not out of order. It's kind of thinking about what are our legacies and what are our responsibilities in the moment that we're in and in the capacities that we have. And so as Environmental Justice Project founding director, I work within an institution that is a land grant university that sort of helped create the very industrialized agricultural landscape of the Central Valley. How we both ended up being the food bowl to the rest of the country, but also the place that has uses 25% of the nation's pesticides, despite only having 2% of its land. Well, that has impacts on the bodies of farm workers and in low-income communities throughout the Central Valley, in the people like Teresita Anda. I want to talk briefly about we were, again, driven by this question of whose stories get told, whose legacies, and who gets to tell the story of places like the Central Valley. The land grab university is something that I have only learned about recently. And again, this is an interesting example of how the data about the land grant and the Morrill Act in 1862 has been there in the archives for a long time. And yet the visualization of this through the land grab university's report and also the website shows us, again, how we can go from recognition to a politics of reparation or restoration. And so, again, this is not my work, but I really want to, throw a lot of ideas out at you. So to hopefully to have a good conversation, because it's sort of what I'm thinking about right now. The land grab university, I really highly recommend playing around with the site. It's quite fascinating. So yesterday I was looking at the land grant universities in Virginia. And for those of you who don't know the basics, basically the Morrill Act was the sale and theft and dispossession of native lands to fund the land grant universities in the United States. And so you can see the two universities in Virginia Polytech, for example, that a lot of that land was from California Indian land. And so you could actually see over time, spatially what dispossession actually looks like. Well, what do we learn? What do we know about this? What is the calculation of what that legacy looks like, and how can that be addressed? That is the political question. I think that's the moment we're in right now. And so again, this is the Virginia state, and there's another one in Virginia as well. It talks about the acres that were sold, how much was paid to, and again, that's 2,100, and then how do you calculate what the returns are over time, whether using inflation, et cetera. And so again, I wanted to, this is not a talk so much as a conversation. And so I want to end, what I'd like to do in my talks is just, throw out a bunch of ideas and then see what sticks. And, because you are all on the East Coast and, maybe you're much more familiar with Benjamin Lay, but I was not. And so I write about him briefly in the 3rd chapter as well. And he is, I think many of us know that Quakers were ardent abolitionists. Well, how did Quakers become abolitionists? Benjamin Lay is part of that history. And so he's a fascinating historical character, person who was, he was a vegetarian. He was, I don't know if the term is dwarf, and he refused to use animals. And he was also very performative in Quaker meetings. He holds the world's records for being thrown out of the most number of Quaker congregations. He was thrown out of 6 of them. Well, I was listening to a podcast about Benjamin Lay on, stuff you missed in history class, and the apology that one of the congregations gave to him set me in tears on a plane a couple of years ago. And so when I think about what the politics of reparations looks like in restoration, I'm not just talking about Benjamin Lay's, the restoration of his reputation. That's not what I mean. But I think, the fact that this congregation made this statement, and that how basically saying he was right and we were wrong, and this is how we move forward, is one model, I think, for what acknowledgement looks like. And I know University of Virginia has its own, institutional politics and its legacies of enslavement. It's the politics around Thomas Jefferson and, all of that issues. And so, I think that you already have some of those conversations happening, and that these are conversations that will not be unfamiliar as we're moving forward in the context of climate change, and looking at what the legacies of basically carbon, and the people hardest hit by it are the ones least responsible, geographically, temporally, and so on. And so these are the politics of climate. And if you don't talk about race and class and colonialism, then I think that we're not really going to get to where we need to go. So I'm going to stop there. That keeps me within my time, and I'll let it go to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much for that talk. That gives us so much to talk about. I'm trying to decide what to start with. And I think, so one thing that really stood out to me in the introduction to your collection sustainability is this line where you say segregating academic knowledge from lived community knowledge is a form of epistemic exclusion. And sort of the importance of including and recognizing and centering the knowledge of precisely the communities who are most impacted was really on my mind as you're talking about both interdisciplinarity and also these university contexts, like the land grab university. It also makes me think of the roles that so many universities have played in gentrification, or even if we're looking at the whole histories of redlining, like very early on in enforcing restrictive covenants and all of that. So I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this looks like, what repair looks like in our scholarship in these contexts of these university community relationships.
I think that's a really good question. And I was looking at, again, the land grab universities and indigenous knowledge is not my area of research at all. I was just playing around with the website, which I think is amazing. But sections talks about what does this all mean? You can do the reports, and then how does that translate into action? And their website actually has a whole okay, what does this mean? And so there are and what it means looks different in different places. So I think in general, a lot of the calls seem to be around, free education for Native students. Obviously this can't be separated from, return of Native bodies, NAGPRA issues and so on. So I would say, on the land grab universities, there is a whole section of what the report has generated in terms of action on different campuses at the land grant universities, where people are saying, oh, well, I didn't know that. Now what? What are we fighting for? Again, a lot of it is scholarships for Native students. I mean, Native students, are so underrepresented in general. But that you could see that even in the slide when they talk about the numbers of the land, number of students, they talk about the contemporary demographics of each university. So Virginia Polytechnic, I think, had like, a very, very low number of Native students, So a lot of it on the, like, it's not an individual level, obviously, but like is about, free education, but I think it's more than that. I think, in the case of the UC Davis, there's a lot of move to transform the curriculum taught. And I think that is like, again, these are not like, linear, these are kind of like constant battles, and then there's always the traps, right? Which is, there can be more recognition of environmental justice, and that's a good thing, I think, by and large. On the other hand, if you have, more discussion of it, but without real resources or power shifts, then it's just, then it's just empty symbolism. And then you're just having more diverse, neoliberal managers of environmental resources. Do you know what I mean? You're not really restructuring or rethinking in a fundamental way. And so I think, again, this is a long way to say, it depends, but I think what's the important part is to have the conversation and to have the organizing push in those ways, and that be done. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is a process. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, to have it be a continual kind of self-reflection process. I think, again, going back to the land grant, again, not my area, you see a lot of this in terms of like, statements about where the land was from, but then there's also, pushback saying, well, so without any kind of shift in power is kind of meaningless. Do you know what I mean? And so I think we're in this moment where we're like, we have to be very careful to make sure it's not just like symbolic in and of itself, but the symbolic can open up. If it can open up to very deep, engaged processes, then it could lead to something very substantive.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I'm curious about the sort of key terms of your talk: recognition, restoration, and repair or reparation. And I sort of see two ideas about recognition coming up, that there's this question of like recognition as understanding or a more widespread acceptance of the empirical data that shows the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental inequalities and stuff like that. But then there's also sort of a mode of recognition where reorienting what it is that we are recognizing is a part of the process of repair, of centering different voices, asking different questions. And so that, but at the same time, that purely only doing recognition may not be, that is not enough. That's not the full process. So I'm sort of, I'm interested in that relationship between recognition, how you're understanding recognition, and then how you're using the terms restoration and repair or reparation, specifically as they're coming from a variety of different fields that use those terms in different ways. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of, I talked briefly about restorative environmental justice in the 3rd chapter. And I think that there are examples, whether or not they use that term, that I would say are restorative. I think this question of repair and restoration, and it goes back to the broader question of sustainability, nature, environment writ large, which is, these themselves are deeply contested, terms like that. So going back to environmental justice, I'm thinking about it, the 30-year anniversary yesterday. A lot of environmental justice was saying, oh, well, your idea of environment and nature, the conceptualization was very narrow. It was wilderness conservationist. It didn't include people of color. It didn't include cities. It didn't include health. And so environmental justice itself was this like attempt to really challenge or, broaden the term of environment. that is also true of sustainability. It is also true of climate justice. It is also true of, all kinds of fields. And so I think, that of repair or restoration, what does restoration mean for, what are we restoring to this, the politics around invasive species, the question of what is what is sustainability? How do you define it? Who is it sustainable for, and who and how? What are you repairing in the repair lab? Do you know what I mean? What is being repaired? You can even see this in like the kind of COVID, moment, like, this whole question of like just recovery. Like, what are we recovering to? Are we just trying to get to like back to normal? And justice movements, I think, are very resistant to that. Like, we're not trying to get back to a more diverse, unequal society. We want an utter transformation of the systems themselves, which are built around hierarchy, racial domination, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot of swirling definitions, obviously. And, I think I do a better job at seeing the parallel conversations that are happening than I am about, I'm not particularly invested in saying, well, restorative environmental justice is only this. Do you know what I mean? Because I think it's context specific and it's part of that process. And reparations ecologies, I use that from Jason Moore, but obviously the call for reparations is a broader one. And the question of, what is reparations and what's its relationship to repair? I think that's super fascinating and something your lab will probably, be spending a fair amount of time talking about. And so again, how do you even have reparations, given the weight of what has happened historically? How do you put a dollar amount on that? How do you quantify that? I mean, these are the biggest questions. But if we think of just going back to climate, that these are just about carbon, like that's, or a scientific technical one. No, that cannot be the extent of that conversation. And so I think but again, my grounding, my position is based on movements. And so I think the movements do a very good job in their specific context of laying out what that looks like. There's a really interesting set of energy democracy collectives that are coming up all around the country. There's so much interesting work around community solar as energy reparations in New Orleans. If you look at what movements are doing, they're really leading about what that looks like. And that's what, coalitions like the Just Transition, Climate Justice Alliance, Movement Generations work, they are the ones who are saying, look, it depends on what, we believe that frontline, fence line communities, and those again are the worst impacted, first impacted, least responsible communities, are at the leading edge of what those responses will look like. And I think, obviously this is my orientation. I think I am movement centered. That's my framework. But I believe that when you actually look at what the organizations and groups are doing, it's actually kind of true. It's actually overwhelming how exciting, how they're trying to live those politics on the ground, away from an individual, everybody's about getting your electric car. Do you know what I mean? A private individualist model of, consumer citizenship. It's much more collective and not private property based, and I think that's exciting. And when you look at what it looks like, that's where I continue to, retain what I talk about in that third chapter of, the politics of the non-naive radical hope. That's where it is in the people and communities that are the worst and most impacted, because they are more creative. They're not as locked into the systems which have already failed them, which depends on their death to be successful, in other words.
Yeah, thank you. That went in all sorts of different directions that I had wanted to ask questions about. And I think I think looking for sort of examples of ways that these things are being imagined really makes a lot of sense as that a way of asking the question of what is repair, what is restoration. And I guess one more term that I would throw in that really stood out to me in the chapter from Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger is trouble. You say we should be troubled by the world and we should seek to trouble it. And the question of solidarity is what to do about what troubles us. And so it really seemed to me that that concept of troubling is sort of at the heart of what this question that you're putting forth here about recognition, restoration, and reparations. And I guess I'll throw that. I'll ask one last question, and then we'll open up the Q&A. I'll connect that with, I wanted to ask you about what you just brought up of this non-naive radical hope, because I also see sort of a through line in what you were writing about that's about affect and sort of that affective relationship that we take toward these questions, or that we see in movements. And that's a conversation that I've seen happening in the environmental humanities more generally a lot recently. Sort of how are we responding to environmental justice and to climate change? And that idea of the non-naive radical hope seems to me actually connected with the idea of troubling, which is why I'm combining that all together into one question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of affect and despair, and, like my colleague, Sarah Jaquette Ray wrote a wonderful book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. I think that, for this is my opinion, I'm not research, but we're in a moment where more people who have been able to be naive to the systems that exist, like cannot ignore or not understand that. And so when I tell that story about not understanding, the climate change, fact sheet, I do that to point to myself, you know what I mean? And there's a quote that I sometimes use about James Baldwin about, I'll try to pull it up. It's one of my favorite quotes about being a monster. Like, if you see the darkness and you ignore it, you're a monster. You have become the monster. Do you know what I mean? And so, for me, the other example I give is, when I went to Berkeley, I remember not understanding what cop watch was. And again, I went to school in the early 90s. People didn't have cell phones. So people would go with big cameras and watch the cops. And in Oakland, I'm a working class Chinatown kid. I wasn't unaware of race and class. Mostly my existence was much more around immigration. But I didn't experience or understand police brutality against Black communities. I didn't, I just didn't live it. Do you know what I mean? And I remember thinking like, oh, why would you need to watch the cops? Do you know what I mean? And so I share these moments to not just laugh at myself, but also to talk about that idea of innocence, and it's a racial innocence. It's an innocence to the darkness of history, and also the existence, the not just history, but how the history still exists every day, but to say, look, there's a moment where you choose. And that's, I think, George Floyd and the protests against police violence kind of opened that, you know what I mean? And so I think for a lot of people who benefited from the existing structures, never saw how their lives were impacted by it. And so, and a lot more people are saying like, oh, now I understand. I didn't really understand. Now I do. And I'm not okay with that. And that's kind of the beautiful moment that we're in. And it's the same thing with climate change, and it's the same thing with wildfires. So in California, you couldn't escape it. It didn't matter if you were rich or white. I mean, I guess it could, because you could leave. Do you know what I mean? But a lot of people who couldn't leave, who are not wealthy, and a lot of people who were wealthy didn't leave. Do you know what I mean? And so that sense of being vulnerable to systems that were out of your control, is a system that, Black, Brown, Indigenous, disempowered communities have live under. That feeling of like threat, violence, lack of control, you don't have agency, and it's I'm sorry, it's terrifying. It's a terrifying feeling. And in some sense, I think the moment we're in is the moment of danger, but it's also the moment of opportunity, where people who lived in innocence cannot look away, and so the question is, what are we going to do about it? Do you know what I mean? we're all vulnerable and we're all connected, and so, this is not to like oversimplify a bifurcation, but, this is the moment where we can connect and, go towards, what Olufemi Taiwo at Georgetown, calls we're in climate, climate apartheid or climate democracy, so it is a crossroads moment, I think. And that has an affective dimension to it. And so, I know for some people it's like, it can lead to like nihilism and you feel like you can't do anything. But I think for a lot more people, it says, like, oh, we gotta throw down here because this is real. This is serious.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure getting to talk to you, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to turn off my camera and hand it over to the Q&A.
Thank you again. This has just been an incredible conversation, and we've been receiving several questions from our audience, and I wanted to begin with one from our co-director of the Repair Lab, Kimberly Fields, who asked if you could say a little bit more about what role academics might play in facilitating or supporting impacted populations' repair and restoration efforts, the ones that are ongoing. And are there any guidelines or recommendations you would give to academics interested in issues involving environmental justice, who might not already be sort of working within that field?
Sorry, I was muted for a second. I just wanted to share the James Baldwin quote because I don't want to butcher Baldwin, and also just put up the Gramsci quote, which, is another guideline for me. So, it said the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born now. Now is the time of monsters. And then, this is the Baldwin quote about, people shutting their eyes invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence is dead, turns himself into a monster. So I wrote a piece on monsters and climate justice that I'm happy to share with you. So the question of the role of academics, I think, is a really important one. And I am always very transparent about who I am and where I got to my politics. My politics are based around students and activism. And that I became an adult through the lens of being in movements. And so for me, that question of what is your scholarship for and who your audience is always been central for me. So my audience has never been other scholars. I never intended to be a professor or be a scholar. What I had was a research question, that was like an itch that I couldn't scratch. Actually, when I was an organizer in New York, and I was really interested, there was all these campaigns going on, and I wanted to know, because if you did organizing, there was all this racial disproportionality, like 7 of the 8 diesel bus depots were in Harlem, and my job as an organizer was to get people to fight those things. But for me, given my academic background and trajectory, I was like, why? Because the city and the polluters would be like, well, that's because that's where zoning is, and I'd be like, well, why is the zoning, why is it zoned like that? And that's a historical question, right? But that was a question that I couldn't answer in the capacity of my, work, but, and I spent a lot of times in my 20s being very insecure about what I could offer, as someone who is trained mostly in English, ethnic studies, and so on. There wasn't a lot of models, for why environmental justice movements would want someone, from the environmental social sciences or humanities. I myself was like, oh, well, I'm not a STEM person. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a quantitative sociologist. What can I do? What's useful? And so in some sense, it can be an unhealthy obsession about what you can offer in a very technical, pragmatic way. I don't feel like that anymore, in part because there are more models of the work and why it's important for community members to see and to understand their histories and, to write. I co-write a lot with community members. So Elizabeth and I just co-wrote a piece about, not just, but we did write a piece about just transition and how Uprose's work is informed by, their climate change work is informed by their work against police violence, their work against gentrification, and so on. So at this point, there's 20 something plus years of scholarship on this, and there's lots of really cool projects that exist, that do the work. And so I think the only way to do the work is, yeah, you do some reading because, we're scholars, we like to know what's already been written. So I'll just say, yes, that work exists. There's lots of really great examples of what collaborative work looks like in environmental justice in particular, but, just writ large, more broadly. Great examples. And then, you bring the people in the room, you have a politics and an ethos of humility always. It's a lot about money and resources and power. The structures of the institution make it really difficult to have this, because of this question of ownership. Like just this morning, I heard from a collaborator of mine, LaDonna Williams, who is, we're working on a public humanities project on, stories of Black Vallejo. She's very skeptical of academics. And in fact, one of her collaborators at Davis, she filed a research misconduct, against him. But we had to repair our relationship because there was this, tension. And now we have a pretty good, but always tense working relationship. And, but again, the only way we can work is because I have a constant politics of deferral. This is your project. My job is to just, enable it to happen. Do you know what I mean? That's my ethos again. But I will have to say, we had to do all this paperwork, and the way that the university and knowledge is structured, is based, because this is affiliated with the university, that project is owned by the university. Well, I said, no, we're not going to sign this. We are going to rewrite it differently. And I was fully expecting the grants office to reject it. Do you know what I mean? Because we said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to have, the university own this project. That is absolutely wrong. Do you know what I mean? If they had said, no, this project can't go forward because this is the way we do this, do you know what I mean? We would have fought that. Do you know what I mean? It's worth that fight. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of your processes of how you go about things or how the university is structured, those themselves are political. And so again, engaging, being honest, having the conversations, again, in a non-linear, non-urgent, non-extractive way, I think is the best way to have functional, healthy relationships that aren't, again, avoiding extraction. I'm an anti-extraction person. I'm against domination and hierarchy in general. But, the politics of extractive research, and higher ed institutions, that is real. That's a real history, and that's an ongoing politics that's in place. Well, you can disrupt politics all the time, and you should, but for me, the values of the movement are what guide me. Whenever I'm not sure, I always go back to the movement principles, the activist voices, and say, am I doing this for ego, or am I doing this, really for community, for the community? I mean, not everybody's inculcated in that culture, but I think it's good to do that. So I don't know if that's too long-winded,
So we have a question here from our colleague Enrico Cesarati, who first thanks you for your inspiring talk, and then adds, quote, "I have no doubts that several universities in the US have been involved in land grabbing, and I understand the relevance of focusing on sites that produce knowledge. At the same time, I was wondering if you could include in your reflections also the sort of land grabbing operated by other parties, corporations, agribusiness enterprises, nations, and which would seem of a much larger and impactful scale."
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I talked about universities in particular, mostly because, we're talking about I've been thinking about where I sit and what the institutional work I can do. Is this frozen? Can you see me, Andrew?
Yeah,
You're
we can
frozen,
hear you.
so I don't know.
You're back.
Okay. Sorry, my internet is not great. And so absolutely that question is central. How I got to care about this is not because of the politics of the institution. It was because movements and organizers were focusing on land grabbing. Again, I came of age politically around the anti-WTO protests in Seattle, the growth of the free trade agreements and so on. And so, absolutely the politics of extraction are corporate, they're transnational corporations, governments enabling them, and so on. I just focused on the institution because of the politics of the repair lab happening, and because I was talking about this. But that is absolutely the central part about the theft of land and labor. Is to me the fundamental problem. Historically and in the contemporary moment. And so how do we acknowledge the histories of the theft of land and labor, but also how there's still ongoing ways in which that is just accepted and normalized. And for me, this goes back to the last question about what is the work. The work for me is always about fighting. You fight those things. You fight those, what the movement generation talks about. They have an incredible visualization of the just transition, which, Andrew, I hope you use in your conceptualization. Movement generation has this framework for a just transition. Maybe I'll pop it up. But they talk about just transition, is usually talked about as like, from carbon to post-carbon. And their vision of like the problems is much more capacious than that. It's against militarism, it's against colonialism, it's against consumerism, very impacted by buen vivir and sort of transnational movements from below. And so there's the critique, absolutely, that question is right on. And it's also the vision of what you want the world to be. And so that's the moving towards. Let me just share briefly. So I really, find their work also helpful. And so this is the visualization of the framework. And so it talks about the extractive economy and the living economy. So the critique of like the negative, the bads, and it talks about, stopping the bad, building the new. And so normally you would see just transition talked about in this sense, the extraction, dig, burn and dump, oil and gas, for example. But their analysis, is again talking about colonialism, consumerism, militarism, and enclosure. And then, again, the living economy as regeneration, deep democracy, caring sacredness, and ecological well-being. They talk about being heavily influenced by peasant movements in Brazil, India, and so on. So, and around like the rights of nature and so on. So yes, that question is right on. I'm not saying that the problems of the university are worse. They're just part of it,
Yeah, actually, I wanted to just quickly ask kind of a related question, because when you pulled up the slide of the land grab website, and I just noticed that the two universities in Virginia, one, Virginia State, is an HBCU. And it reminded me as well of there's a newer book that has come out by Elena Roberts talking about the history of African Americans on native lands in the West, and how African Americans are being denied 40 acres on the lands that they'd been enslaved on, and then instead being pushed onto native lands in the Oklahoma Territory. And it kind of makes me sort of wonder about how do we begin to sort of conceptualize justice within a framework that oftentimes forces sort of movements for justice or reparations to be at the expense of other dispossessed people, and sort of how do we sort of break out of these cycles, which oftentimes lead disadvantaged groups to pursue opportunity through or by necessity through the exploitation of others.
That's super interesting, and I didn't even know that. So, I think that I don't know how many of the land grant universities are HBCUs. It just that's a really important question. And so, again, for me, the readings I go back to, and scholars and the work that matters, people like Ruthie Gilmore, who writes a lot about incarceration. Laura Pulido writes a lot about, these are environmental justice scholars. She has a great piece called Frequently Asked Questions for Scholar Activists. So that's kind of my go-to to like, I give this to students and say, read this, But, the other one is Charles Hale, who's a sociologist, and he wrote a book called Engaging the Contradictions. And so, for me, that idea of, these things are messy, and they were messy at their time, and they're messy now, but we have to engage with them. It's the denial that I find the most like odious. Do you know what I mean? This idea that, none of it matters because it's, in the past.
Oh, so actually on that, I wanted to get back to something you talked about earlier, and this is a question from our colleague and co-director, Sarah Mylov. And she was struck by your phrase, non-naive radical hope. And it intrigued her as someone who's herself prone to declension narratives and cynicism, but with each passing day, as she notes, there are headlines declaring that the window for avoiding a climate catastrophe is closing. So with that in mind, how can scholarship ignite hope rather than despair?
Well, I wanted to, that's why I shared the 8 Your Mama's heat wave, because within climate justice movements, and especially youth movements, and again, I'm not saying this as someone who's on Twitter or follows it a lot, but I'm struck by the voices and the hip hop and the cultural production within climate justice youth oriented movements. And those narratives are not declension narratives. They're angry and they're often funny, but they're not declension narratives. That structure does not work for younger folks. And so Movement Generation has this very funny web series called The North Pole, which is sort of 8 episodes of 8 minutes each. And there's a lot of radical politics around them. It basically, the plot line is like four friends, 3 of whom are Black and brown. One of them is undocumented in Oakland, and they are facing gentrification, but also the after the impacts of climate change, in heat waves, fires, asthma attacks, et cetera. It's a stories. There's stories around. You care about them as people. And so what Movement Generation does is sort of create new narratives around climate justice. And it's a very, I was curious about whether it was too didactic or whether it actually speaks to students. And I actually taught it in my intro class with 150 students. And it actually teaches pretty well. Like, the students liked it. And so they got a lot of politics and analysis and critique, but sort of like in a story form, in 8-minute, social media. So it's not going to be like, you and I are the same generation, I think, like hour and a half, honor the earth kind of documentaries. Like, that's not going to work and ignite people. Do you know what I mean? And so I think, if you look around, you'll see like Dallas Goldtooth, who's a major anti-pipeline organizer, is also a part of an all indigenous comedy group called the 1491s. Do you know what I mean? And so he talks about how the comedy is how he gets through the trauma. Do you know what I mean? And so I think for me, I wrote this piece about climate justice and youth satire in, hip hop. And, that's why I came across the 8 Your Mama's heat wave video. I think if it actually, there's a lot that's happening on the ground. And so, we also have to, we as sort of maybe older academics who are bound by different narrative structures, have to actually open and see what's happening. And which isn't to say that, the folks who are making that aren't also despairing, because that's the non-naive part. It's like, yeah, people understand the science and the stakes. But if there are any people who understand the science and the stakes, it's Black and brown youth. And in the book I think I close with the Langston Hughes poem, Like Kids Who Die, and so I think, again, it's the cultural production that is the hopeful part to me. Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise we would all just be like mass, throwing ourselves off of cliffs, because it's just why bother? And it's the rejection of the why bother that I think is why the environmental justice movements matter so much, because they have fought, not won most of the time, because I think it's unreasonable to ask them to win all the time. Do you know what I mean? Given the forces that are stacked against them. But it's in the fight, it's in the refusal to roll over and die, that where I retain the hope,
Yeah, it's the struggle. And so do you have time for one more question before? Okay, so this kind of moves us in a different direction. And this comes from Corey Shaman. And he says, justice and EJ efforts seem most often oriented toward reparations, restoration, and for humans, and rightly so for obviously good reasons. But I wonder if you can steer us toward EJ work that construes justice more broadly to include non-human constituents in genuinely serious ways alongside justice for vulnerable humans. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive, but it seems like too often that's the case in both traditional environmental activism and EJ activism.
I don't know that I totally agree with that, but I would think again about the work of indigenous environmental science and collaborative efforts around restoration around indigenous lands, and politically that would be, sort of land back movements and so on. So I think, indigenous efforts, again, knowing that these are very fraught and complicated, but around river restoration, around rights to burn, cultural burns and so on. I don't think that that's true if you really look at indigenous efforts. I think, but I appreciate the point about the relationship between human and non-human nature. Going back to the North Pole, which part of why I find it so remarkable is that there's this connection of people of color and animals in that, which I think, is an ontology that is quite widespread. And so I don't think that I would agree that environmental justice privileges the human as separate from the non-human. Certainly not in indigenous struggles, but also I think there's more of an idea of the recognition of the relationship. And, it's a fraught relationship because of the histories of racial dehumanization and animalization of people of color, specifically African Americans and Native people. But, I think there's more I think there's more actually than, I would not conflate like kind of mainstream conceptions of it with environmental justice. I think there's always been both sometimes a fear, but also an acceptance that there is a deep relationship. And I'm talking about humans and non-human beings, animals in particular. But I think, it's an important question to always foreground. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. This has been an incredibly generative conversation that, as I said at the outset, is, your work is really at the center of so many of the questions and approaches that we're taking with this lab. And this has helped to sort of shape our ideas and given us much to sort of work toward. So let's all, I guess, give a virtual, applause for Professor Julie Z. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and we really appreciate your time. So.
Thank you.
All right.